3 weeks from the nearest scrap of land, and the sky over the Caribbean has turned the color of a fresh bruise. The sea is climbing 30 feet into the air, like it's trying to swallow the ship whole. Then it happens. Not a cannon blast. Worse than a cannon blast. Crack. A sound that rips through the entire hull, louder than any broadside. The mainmast is split down the center like a matchstick, and somewhere below the waterline, a plank is torn loose from its frame. Seawater is pouring into the gun deck through a hole the size of a barrel. The captain is screaming orders nobody can hear over the wind. The quartermaster is bracing against the rail, white-knuckled, useless. Men are praying to gods they stopped believing in the day they signed the articles. And in the middle of all that chaos, every single eye on that ship turns to one man. Not the man with the sword, not the man with the compass. The man with an axe in one hand, a mouthful of iron nails, and sawdust ground so deep into the creases of his knuckles it will never wash out. The ship's carpenter. Because in the next 60 seconds, this one man is either going to save every life aboard, or all of them, captain included, are going to the bottom of the Atlantic, in a wooden coffin with the black flag still snapping from the mast. Today we're talking about the most underrated soul in the entire history of piracy. The man nobody writes songs about. The man who never gets his own flag, his own legend, or his own action figure. And by the time this video is over, you're going to understand exactly why pirate crews, democratic, mutinous, brutally practical pirate crews, who would vote a captain off his own ship for cowardice, paid this man almost as much as they paid the man in command. Here's the mistake almost everyone makes when they hear the word carpenter. They picture a man who builds furniture, maybe fixes a broken chair, patches a leaky barrel, whittles something in his spare time. On a pirate ship, that picture is wrong in almost every way. He was the closest thing the golden age of piracy had to a structural engineer, and the vessel he maintained was, without exaggeration, the most advanced machine most of these men would ever touch in their entire lives. Think about what wood actually was in the year 1720. It wasn't a rustic, old-fashioned material. It was the high technology of the age, the same way a modern engineer today has to understand alloys and composites and stress tolerances. A carpenter had to know the difference between seasoned English oak and green, unseasoned timber that would warp and crack within a season. He had to know that elm belonged below the waterline because it resisted rot when constantly submerged, while pine and fir were reserved for masts and decking because they were lighter and more flexible under wind load. Get that wrong and the ship you're sailing is a liability from the day it leaves harbor. And here's a fact that surprises most people. Every wooden ship in the age of sail leaked, not sometimes, not the badly maintained ones, all of them. The moment a hull touched salt water, it began taking on water through 1,000 microscopic gaps between the planks. The question was never whether your ship was leaking, it was whether the carpenter could keep the leaking under control faster than the ocean could win. That battle started every single morning before the sun was fully up. The carpenter's first duty of the day was sounding the well, lowering a measuring rod into the lowest point of the hull to see exactly how much water had crept in overnight. A normal reading, the crew pumped it out and the day continued. A rising reading meant the carpenter had to go hunting, crawling through the cramped, waterlogged, stinking lower decks in near total darkness, running his bare hands along every seam, feeling for the telltale trickle that meant trouble. Then there was the wood itself, working against him from the inside. In tropical Caribbean water, a brand new hull fresh out of a European shipyard might stay clean for 6 months before the real enemy arrived. Pterodo worms, sometimes called shipworms, aren't actually worms at all. They're a type of saltwater clam, and they bore directly into hull planking, tunneling through the wood until a beam that looks completely solid from the outside is hollow and crumbling within. Barnacles piled on top of that, encrusting the hull below the waterline, and adding so much drag that a fast ship could lose half its speed in a matter of months. In a business where speed was the difference between catching a prize and being caught by a Navy frigate, that mattered more than almost anything else on board. This is why careening was such a critical, dangerous ritual for every pirate crew. Without access to a proper dry dock, the only way to clean and repair a hull below the waterline was to find a sheltered, secluded beach, run the ship aground at high tide, and physically haul it over onto its side using tackle rigged from the masts. The entire crew had to unload cannons and cargo to lighten the ship first, and for the hours or days it sat there, beached and helpless, tipped over like a wounded animal, the whole crew was exposed, to local inhabitants, to rival pirates, to any naval patrol that happened to spot smoke on the horizon. The carpenter supervised the entire operation, scraping barnacles, repacking every seam with oakum, which was simply old rope fibers picked apart by hand, sealing it all with hot pitch, and coating the hull with tallow or sulfur mixtures meant to slow the worms down for another few months. None of this was decoration. This was survival infrastructure, and the man in charge of it had usually spent 7 full years learning the trade, starting as a boy of 12 or 13 apprenticed to a master shipwright, long before he ever set foot on a pirate deck. His workshop, if you could call it that, sat near the bow below the main deck. Nothing glamorous, a workbench bolted to the frame, racks of spare timber, coils of oakum, barrels of pitch and tallow, and a wall of tools that had no modern equivalent for most people watching this. Caulking mallets and irons for driving oakum into seams, augers and drills for boring through solid oak, adzes for shaping raw timber into curved hull planking by eye and by hand, chisels, gouges, saws of a dozen different sizes, each one meant for a specific cut. And he tracked every single scrap of spare wood on board like his life depended on it, because it did. Running out of repair material in the middle of the Atlantic wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence, with a countdown attached. Now picture the worst possible moment for all of that fragile, constantly leaking wood. A broadside. 2 ships trading cannon fire at close range, and here's something the movies almost never show you. A cannonball hitting a wooden hull doesn't punch a clean, tidy hole. Wood shatters. It explodes into razor-sharp splinters, some of them a foot long, traveling at lethal speed through the packed lower decks. Historians who study naval combat in this era will tell you something genuinely disturbing. More sailors were killed and maimed by flying wood splinters during the age of sail than by the cannonballs themselves. A 6-inch splinter driven into a man's chest by the force of an impact was every bit as deadly as a musket ball. While all of that was happening above him, while the ship rocked from broadside after broadside, while gunpowder smoke turned the air black and wounded men screamed in the dark, the Carpenter's war was being fought in a completely different place. The orlop deck, the lowest, most claustrophobic, most dangerous deck on the entire ship, sitting right at or below the waterline, exactly where the enemy's cannonballs were doing the most damage. His primary weapon in this fight was something called a shot plug, a cone-shaped piece of wood, carved and shaped to jam directly into a fresh cannonball hull. He'd drive it into the breech with a mallet, hammer it tight, then pack oakum around the edges and seal the whole thing with pitch. If a hole was too large for a single plug, he might nail a sheet of lead or a layer of leather over the wound as a stopgap. And he was making split-second engineering judgments in near total darkness, with men bleeding out around him, deciding in real time whether a section of hull could survive long enough for the battle to end, or whether the ship was already doomed. This is exactly why the pirate Articles of Agreement, the written contracts every crew member signed before a voyage, almost universally exempted the Carpenter from boarding actions. He wasn't kept off the front line because anyone thought less of him. It was the opposite. Losing 3 ordinary sailors in a boarding fight was a tragedy the crew could absorb. Losing the one man who understood the ship's entire structural system could sink every survivor on board within the hour. Keeping him alive and below decks wasn't cowardice, it was cold, democratic, collectively agreed upon strategy. There's also a detail almost nobody talks about. Pirates, unlike naval warships, usually didn't want to sink the vessel they were attacking. The entire point of the fight was to capture the prize intact and take everything inside it. So while cannon fire was tearing into a merchant ship, the pirate Carpenter was already assessing the enemy's condition from a distance, judging whether the boarding crew could seize the prize before it went under. And once a ship was captured, he was frequently the very first man sent aboard to inspect it, deciding whether it was worth keeping, stripping for parts, or abandoning entirely. Some of the most valuable prizes captured during the golden age of piracy weren't loaded with gold at all. They were simply better, sounder, less worm-eaten ships than the one the pirates already had. When Blackbeard converted the captured French slave ship, Loch and Cord, into the Queen Anne's Revenge, cutting new gun ports through the hull, reinforcing the deck to handle heavier cannon, restructuring the interior to carry a crew many times larger than it was designed for. That transformation was months of skilled carpentry work, and it turned a merchant vessel into one of the most feared warships in the Caribbean. And now we get to the part most documentaries skip entirely, because it's uncomfortable, and because it doesn't fit the romantic version of pirate life. On the majority of pirate ships, especially the smaller ones, there was no trained surgeon. Real medical men were rare, expensive, and usually unwilling to volunteer for a life of piracy with a noose waiting at the end of it. So when a man's leg was crushed under a rolling cannon, or a splinter tore through his shoulder, or a cannonball took an arm clean off, who did the crew turn to? The man with the sharpest saws on the ship, the man who already knew how to cut through solid material with precision and how to join broken things back together, the carpenter. Using the same cross-cut saws he used to shape ship timber, the carpenter would perform amputations on the same deck where he repaired hull planking hours earlier. And when the cutting was done, he reached for the same hot pitch he used to waterproof the seams of the ship, the exact same tar, and used it to cauterize the wound, sealing the blood vessels shut with heat, because there was nothing else available that would work fast enough to save a man's life. There was no anesthesia beyond a mouthful of rum and something to bite down on. The screaming that followed was, by every surviving account from the period, some of the worst sound a pirate crew ever had to sit through. It was brutal, it was crude by any modern standard, but for a wounded man 3 weeks from the nearest port, it was very often the only chance he had. This dual role tells you something important about what these men actually were. Not a tradesman who happened to fix wood. A ship's carpenter had to understand structural engineering, materials science, and a working knowledge of the human body, all without a single textbook to guide him, all learned through a brutal 7-year apprenticeship and years of hard experience at sea. This brings us to the question that should have been obvious from the very beginning. If this one man was responsible for keeping the ship afloat, keeping it fast enough to outrun the Navy, and keeping the crew alive when the surgeon wasn't available, how much was he actually paid? Pirate ships, by the standards of their era, were remarkably democratic institutions. The crew elected their captain and could vote him out. The quartermaster was chosen to represent the crew's interests and settle disputes fairly, and the division of every single piece of plunder was governed by written articles of agreement that every man on board signed before the voyage even began. These weren't vague promises. They were detailed legal contracts specifying exact shares down to the fraction. Under a typical set of articles, like the ones associated with Bartholomew Roberts, the captain might receive 2 full shares of the plunder, the quartermaster 1 3/4 shares, an ordinary sailor received a single share, and the carpenter typically received 1.5 to 1 3/4 shares, putting him on equal footing with the quartermaster and just below the captain himself. On some ships he was paid exactly the same as the man in command. In a system where every man had a vote, the crew collectively decided, again and again, across dozens of different ships and captains, that the carpenter's labor was worth nearly as much as leadership itself. That wasn't generosity. That was every single man on board understanding exactly how much his own life depended on this one specialist. The articles went even further. If the carpenter was wounded in battle, his compensation was among the highest of any role on the ship. Bartholomew Roberts's article specified that losing a right arm was worth 600 pieces of 8, and losing a leg 500. Those weren't arbitrary numbers pulled from nowhere. They reflected a hard, practical truth the entire crew understood. A carpenter who lost a hand in battle wasn't just another wounded man. It was a catastrophic loss to the operational survival of everyone left on board. And there's one more detail that reveals just how far this protection extended. Unlike guns, ammunition, and nearly everything else on a pirate ship, which technically belonged to the entire crew collectively, the carpenter's personal tool chest belonged to him alone. If the ship was lost, if the crew was forced to abandon her entirely, the article specifically protected his right to take his tools with him. They were that valuable, and everyone on board knew exactly why. The archaeological record backs all of this up in remarkable detail. When the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge was discovered off the coast of North Carolina in 1996, divers recovered caulking tools, augers, and specialized woodworking implements that confirm a skilled carpenter was actively working on that ship. When Sam Bellamy's Whydah went down off Cape Cod in April of 1717, the wreck yielded Carpenter's tools and spare planking, proof that its carpenter was maintaining the vessel right up until the storm that finally beat him. Henry Every's raid on the Mughal ship Ganges Sawai in 1695, still remembered as one of the most profitable pirate scores in history, only worked because his ship the Fancy was lighter and faster than the vessel he was chasing. Every's crew had careened and cleaned her hull before the pursuit even began, and that maintenance work, carried out by his carpenter, was directly responsible for one of the richest hauls any pirate crew ever pulled off. Bartholomew Roberts, who captured more ships than any other pirate in recorded history, ran a crew where the vessels were kept clean, careened on schedule, and maintained by carpenters who had every resource they needed. That wasn't luck, that was policy. And when a crew didn't have one, the results were exactly as grim as you'd expect. Charles Vane, one of the most notorious pirates of the early 1700s, alienated much of his crew, including his skilled tradesmen, and his ship slowly deteriorated from neglect until it was too slow and too damaged to outrun the Navy vessel that eventually caught him. Stede Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, a wealthy landowner with no sailing background whatsoever, struggled constantly with basic ship maintenance for the same reason. A ship without a good carpenter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a death sentence with a delay on it. So the next time you picture a pirate ship, black flags snapping in the wind, cannons run out, cutting through the Caribbean like something out of a legend, remember what's actually holding that entire image together. Not the captain shouting orders on the quarterdeck. It's a quiet, calloused man below deck with sawdust in his hair, checking the bilge, testing the pumps, making absolutely sure the whole thing doesn't sink before breakfast. Every pirate story, when you strip away the myth, is at its foundation a carpenter's story, because without the carpenter, there was no ship, and without the ship, there were no pirates, just a crew of angry men standing on a beach, staring at the horizon, wondering where their ride went. Which role do you think was tougher to survive, the carpenter down in the dark with the water rising, or the surgeon with a saw in his hand? Let us know down in the comments. Fair winds, and we'll see you on the next voyage.